And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner here on this Washington Examiner Wednesday, and it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today once again. Thanks for joining us. If you have not done so already, please be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. In addition, on Twitter, you can follow me at Sang Center. That's saying with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. And on Facebook, facebook.com/Jimmy Sengenberger Pro. Also, be sure to follow our partners at the Washington Examiner on social media, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as at WashingtonExaminer.com. We are going to jump right in to today's conversation without further ado. On Wednesdays here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, we like to bring on our friends and partners at the Washington Examiner. And today, I am so pleased on this Washington Examiner Wednesday to be joined by none other than the politics editor for the Washington Examiner, Jim Antle. It's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
So, this is a topsy-turvy electoral environment, and today I really want to focus on breaking down a lot of the different dynamics and things going on in terms of the current state of play with this election cycle. So let me just ask you, right now, how do you see things as panning out for Trump versus Biden in particular? Because, I mean, this is a year that is very different from anything anybody could have anticipated in so many facets, so many ways.
Oh, definitely. At the beginning of this year, President Trump was planning on running for re-election on a peace and prosperity record. So, we had historically low unemployment. We had healthy economic growth. We're as close as we get to peacetime in the current era of never-ending wars. So that was a pretty inviting platform to run on. It was still going to be a competitive race. But that was all upended when we had the coronavirus pandemic, and that ended the low unemployment. That created an illness situation that has people very afraid. And then if that wasn't all enough to deal with, we had, after the death of George Floyd, a lot of unrest in major cities and a lot of concern about racial issues and a lot of sort of relitigating controversies dating all the way back to the American founding, maybe even before. So it really changed the environment in which President Trump was running for re-election and just made the overall state of the country look a lot less favorable and maybe a little bit more chaotic, which is a much tougher position to be in as an incumbent than running on everything is great. Maybe you don't like my tweets, maybe you do like them, but you have to like what's going on with your 401k. No major problems are really occurring in the country that would not obviously be occurring under some other president as well. So it really detracted from the main argument I think President Trump was going to make and put Joe Biden in a position where he could essentially hide in his basement for extended periods of time, for weeks at a time, and not say very much. It didn't even have to be particularly coherent because he doesn't have to say very much at all, and then jump out to a double-digit lead in the national polling. And more concerning, I think, for President Trump is that Biden has jumped out to a healthy lead in a lot of the battleground state polling, and particularly in some of the swing states that are going to determine who wins in the Electoral College. So the present state of play for President Trump is not very good, but politics in America is very volatile right now, and there's still a long way to go. So we haven't had the conventions yet. Joe Biden hasn't picked his running mate. People haven't really focused that much on Biden. Perhaps they're not even paying that much attention yet to aspects of the campaign like ads and speeches and things of that nature. So there are some very discouraging signs, I think, for President Trump, but it's not over yet.
Jim Antle, one of the things that President Trump has been really trying to do is motivate his base. We saw the president already in the beginning of this year doing rally after rally after rally. That's what he does. I mean, I went to the February rally down in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and the energy, the enthusiasm, the dynamism was truly something. It was a spectacle. I hadn't been to a rally since October of 2016, and the environment was very different. And what I realized is that he puts the best show on earth. At least that's what he's trying to do. Is you come to my events, you come to my rallies, and you're going to leave with a very memorable experience. Coronavirus has made that impossible for months to do. Now he's starting to step it up a little bit with the Mount Rushmore rally and a couple rallies prior to that, really trying to figure out ways to motivate what you've called a restive base. Talk to us about that dynamic and how you see it playing out a little bit.
Well, I think one of the things that has been consistent for President Trump throughout his term is that the base has really stayed loyal to him. They've stayed with him. They've stood by him in countless controversies. And even as his overall job approval rating has fluctuated, Republican voters and some of the swing voters who turned out for Trump in the Rust Belt states in 2016, they've largely stuck by him. And his Republican approval ratings have remained sky high throughout most of his presidency. We've seen some small slippage in that area, which he can't really afford since the pandemic, and particularly since the Floyd protests. And so there are things that President Trump needs to do to motivate the base, to begin to make them feel reassured that he's with them and that he's going to deliver for them, and to make them more afraid of Joe Biden than they currently are. There was certainly no real problem getting people to be worried about what would happen if Hillary Clinton became president. Certainly people on the right. She'd been a controversial figure for conservatives for a quarter century by that point. Joe Biden has been around even longer than Hillary Clinton was, but he doesn't inspire quite that same fear and revulsion, quite frankly. So President Trump has to do other things to motivate people, and I think he's starting to try to do those now.
Once again, Jim Antle, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads on this Washington Examiner Wednesday. And I mean, it is a very different dynamic, I think, than the campaigns we're anticipating on going into 2020. I mean, in every way, in terms of the country and our current state of affairs, but even in terms of campaigning, as you were mentioning before, Joe Biden, for weeks on end, it seemed, was in his basement, not, going out and about, not doing interviews that he couldn't try and control and be able to minimize his exposure in that way.
Right.
And I think the Democrats were really intentional in that, and they want to continue, it seems, that sort of approach for Joe Biden. Instead of putting him out front in instance after instance, they want to keep him behind the scenes and just let President Trump tweet all he wants and let things play out, while Biden sort of seems to stay above it all, even though he's more out of the picture.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think even before we had the coronavirus and before we had the recession and before we had George Floyd, the Democrats really thought their best case to win this election was if it was a referendum on President Trump. And if people were going to vote on tweets and they were going to vote on temperament. But they were more worried about what might happen if the election was seen as a binary choice, where people not only were evaluating Trump, but were looking at their own nominee. Now, early on, there was some possibility that'd be Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden was considered the less threatening of the two of them, but still, if Biden's past record is evaluated, if his support for current left-wing policies of the Democratic Party gets more scrutiny, if even just how up to this job is he still at this point at age 77, he turned 78 a little bit after Election Day, so he will be older when he takes the oath of office than Ronald Reagan was when he left office. Reagan, before Trump, was the oldest president to ever serve. Trump would also get out of office at a much younger age than Joe Biden would be starting. So, and you'd end up having an 80-year-old president if he lived to halfway through his term. So those are all things that I think in a binary choice election would be litigated and debated. But Biden, because of everything going on in the state of the country, has been able to take a back seat, and the focus has all been entirely on Trump. And the Trump campaign has had to try to deal with that and try to find ways to change that narrative. And so far, they haven't been successful.
And one thing, again, we're talking with Jimmy Antle, politics editor at the Washington Examiner, our partners here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. One thing that has really provided fodder, so to speak, political fodder for both sides of the aisle have been the protest movements that we've seen, where Black Lives Matter has provided some reinvigorating energy, it seems, to both sides of the aisle. Right. Although what we've seen on the Democratic side is much more on their chosen issues and some of the racial passions that they like to utilize in a political context. The Republican side, though, looks at this and says, okay, we're seeing monuments being torn down and these statues being removed and all of these things from riots and looting. This is an opportunity for us to kind of regenerate our base as well. How do you see, Jim, both sides taking this protest movement that we've seen across the country with regards to Black Lives Matter and turning it to its own political advantage, or at least trying to make that happen? Because even though there are those who will say, hey, we're just motivated by passion for the country and because we believe in the cause, right, the reality is these are political opportunities for both sides.
They absolutely are. And what we've seen so far is that the Democrats have done a much better job of taking advantage of this situation than the Republicans. Democrats have definitely essentially argued that if you don't support virtually the entirety of the progressive agenda, you are siding with systemic racism. They have boldly launched attacks on Republicans. They have embraced more and more of the progressive agenda and sort of framed this as an anti-racist agenda. And Republicans have been running scared. They've been a little more hesitant to speak out. They've been cautious about what they've said about some of the statue toppling. They've been cautious about what they've said about some of the rioting and more violent protests. And they've offered sort of tepid police reforms that you maybe don't go far enough for progressives and then don't necessarily satisfy the base. I think with President Trump, the Mount Rushmore speech and some of the subsequent things he's done, you're starting to see that change, at least especially with the Trump campaign, that they are going to go on the offensive, that they are betting that there are a lot of Republican voters who don't like what they're seeing in the country right now, whether that's some of the violence in the cities, which isn't just limited to protests at this point. We're starting to see, as police have stood down in places like New York City, spikes in shootings, spikes in shooting-related deaths. We're seeing young children getting killed in Atlanta. So there's been some more attention focused on the law and order perspective. And also there's a lot of anger about, are we erasing and allowing the erasure of our national symbols,
Right.
not just Confederate statues, but Christopher Columbus and people central to the American founding, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. You know, can anything that existed prior to 1965 or maybe even
Yeah.
1985 survive? And the
Jim,
Trump campaign is really starting to drill down on that.
one thing that I just find so striking you were mentioning about the founding fathers. I mean, there was an op-ed just yesterday, or just this week, in the New York Times calling for the removal of the Jefferson Memorial. So this isn't even just the
Right.
protest movements. This is something that is in mainstream liberal publications.
That's right. You see, mainstream liberals are chasing the far left at this point and trying to stay ahead of the parade, or at least no more than a couple steps behind it. And this is actually something that Joe Biden has been very good at for all of his career, which is trying to find wherever the center of gravity is in the Democratic Party, and be a millimeter to the left of it or a millimeter to the right of it, depending on what is most politically advantageous. Now, Biden has wisely not taken the most extreme positions on statue removal and monument implosions and things like that. So it's left President Trump having to make the more nuanced argument that, okay, Biden himself might not be this radical, but electing him will empower people who are.
Yeah, and for some support for that particular claim, I think we can go to Senator Tammy Duckworth in Cut 1 of the state of Illinois. She's a Democrat, and she had this to say about Mount Rushmore.
So that might be true, but George Washington, I don't think anybody would call him a traitor. And there are moves by some to remove statues of him. Is that a good idea?
I think we should listen to everybody. I think we should listen to the argument there. But remember that the president at Mount Rushmore was standing on ground that was stolen from Native Americans who had actually been given that land during a treaty. And again, let's talk about the greater context of where we are in our country right now.
Land stolen. Well, let's go 5 years ago. This is pick one. This is Senator Duckworth. Just 5 years ago in 2015. And she had a social media post that she posted. And there we go. And here you can see that she was tweeting with excitement how just the next year she might dress up to celebrate Mount Rushmore. And there's a photograph celebration. They're changing their tune, but in a way that's pretty darn obvious and political and doesn't seem particularly sincere to me, Jim Antle.
No, it doesn't. It's definitely, as I said earlier, just them trying to catch up to what the mob wants them to say and to do. And they're not really, as a party, really that inclined to push back on any of this. I mean, you saw that she did quietly say no when asked if George Washington was a traitor, but she also didn't seem to want to really argue with anybody who says we should take down his statues. She was going to be pretty muted on that point. And then once you start saying Mount Rushmore was stolen, what limits you to saying that the rest of the United States wasn't stolen? You could certainly make some of those types of claims, and there are people who do. So what is the limiting principle here? And the limiting principle seems to only be, I don't want to go so far to the left, I'm going to lose an election to President Trump. And that seems to be the only thing that limits how far progressives are willing to go at this point.
Jim Antle, just a little bit longer with you here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Again, politics editor at the Washington Examiner. And one thing that I've been looking for among the Democrats across the country, especially those being considered by Joe Biden as possible vice presidential nominee, I've been looking for the notion of leadership on these issues and not simply taking political topics and using them to their advantage or taking these serious social unrest matters that we're seeing across the country and turning them into political advantage. And the only person that I could see really show some leadership has been Mayor Bottoms of Atlanta, Georgia, who once again was just scolding the Black Lives Matter movement for not taking seriously protection of innocent life, like the 8-year-old who died over this past weekend, the 8-year-old little girl. It's just so sad and tragic what's happening. And yet Keisha Bottoms seems to be the only one who's speaking out. I would like you to talk a little bit about that, that, but also about the vice presidential selection process that Joe Biden's going through right now? Because she's on the list.
Yes, and she'd be a very strong person to be considering. I mean, because she does, in addition to checking the demographic boxes that he'd obviously like to check, as a mayor of a large city, she could argue she has executive experience, and she has been willing to criticize some of the more left-wing and activist things that have been said since the death of George Floyd. She's also been willing to take a sort of measured response, being willing to defend law enforcement against lawlessness, while at the same time clearly having substantial sympathy for the concerns of peaceful protesters. So there would be good reason for Joe Biden to consider her. I think the overall dilemma Biden faces in this choice is that he needs to pick someone who is a plausible president, because the unfortunate but unavoidable reality is that he is an older man, and the odds of this person becoming president themselves is significantly higher than with a typical running mate. And he also has to take into consideration the fact that he's an older white man in a Democratic Party that is not necessarily demographically representative of at this point, and that he represents a specific wing of the party, and that the other wing of the party, the more Bernie Sanders wing of the party, has shown some tendency to stay home or even vote for President Trump in small numbers, but large enough numbers to maybe flip a state like Michigan. So given that tendency, you have to make them feel represented. So it has to potentially be a person who could claim to be a diversity pick while also claiming to be a plausible president, while also being left-wing enough to satisfy the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, while also not being so left-wing it scares away the moderates who turned to Joe Biden in the first place because they were horrified by Bernie Sanders. So that's a lot of things to have to take into consideration.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Jim Antle, I think that is crucial to his thought process. But also, what is striking to me, and I alluded to this before, is the lack of leadership that isn't so transparently ideological, though, on the Democratic side. At least that's what it seems to me when we talk about Keisha Bottoms. But going back to the early days of the riots that we were seeing in the aftermath of the George Floyd initial protests, we started seeing riots, and that happened in Atlanta, Georgia. This was prior to the shooting that took place police shooting that took place in Atlanta, Georgia, that spurred more riots. Yeah. She was one person who was saying, "Calm, this is wrong." She brought Killer Mike and other leaders of the civil rights movement to show up and speak with her to call for calm and call for leadership. And then again, we're seeing that now. Why do you think it's just the mayor of Atlanta who is showing that kind of leadership? At least that's my impression on the Democratic side right now.
Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, some of it may just be her personal fortitude. Some of it may happen to be the fact that Atlanta is an upwardly mobile city at this point, and she doesn't want to interrupt that progress by having a precipitous drop in public safety. Clearly, if you're a Bill de Blasio, if you're a left-wing mayor in a major city, there's not a lot of political downside, at least in the immediate term, to siding with the protesters, even if that means you tolerate some things that are not peaceful, so that you don't get outflanked on your left by somebody who's willing to go further than you. But longer term, New York City is a good example, because it's a city that did throughout the 90s end up having a Republican mayor because people got so fed up with the crime and the quality of life issues in the city. The thing about local government is you do actually have to deliver tangible results at some point. People, want, the potholes fixed, and they want, criminals caught, and they don't want to be mugged in the streets. So, a mayor, no matter how activist or left wing, is at some point going to have to deliver on those things. And you'd think you'd see more Democratic elected officials in the cities feeling that pressure right now, but so far, most of them don't.
And final topic and question for you, Jim Antle. You wrote a piece over the weekend for the Washington Examiner talking about what President Trump is doing as far as the new NAFTA, this USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, and how he's really trying to use that to build up some more populist support. What are you noticing as far as this I think it just now went into effect, the USMCA?
It did. It went into effect just last week. And so what they're trying to do is, number one, showcase this as a major campaign promise that President Trump has fulfilled. He said he would renegotiate what he considered to be bad trade deals, and NAFTA was his number one example of such deals. And NAFTA was obviously a deal that Bill Clinton got implemented into law, that Joe Biden voted for, was a very key issue in the campaign against Hillary Clinton, helped President Trump win some of the Rust Belt states that put him in the White House. So this is a populist agenda item to renegotiate NAFTA in a way that he thinks or says is more beneficial to American interests, jobs, and manufacturing. And so, number one, this delivers on a populist agenda item in a tangible way, maybe even more so than the progress that's been made thus far on the wall. Number two, it's a bipartisan accomplishment. It passed both houses of Congress, overwhelming majority. It's got a lot of Democratic support. So this is something that helps show that the president can get things done. And I think he needs examples like that right now.
Jim Antle, politics editor for our partners at the Washington Examiner. It is always so great to check in with you guys here on Jimmy at the Crossroads for Washington Examiner Wednesday. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Thank you. Once again, Jim Antle, politics editor at the Washington Examiner, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, which is coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Well, that is all we've got for you today. Never fear, we will be back once again tomorrow with more engaging, intelligent talk, sang style, here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. YouTube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. In addition, like me on Facebook and subscribe or follow on Twitter. Like, subscribe, and all those good things for our friends at the Washington Examiner on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, WashingtonExaminer.com. My thanks to my brother Justin for sitting in for Nathan Matouche, producer extraordinaire today, and to you for watching. Enjoy the day, be safe, and God bless America.